Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or at least afternoon here in the Mountain Time Zone. My name is Kyle Basinski. I'm the director of the Research Institute at Crow Canyon, and thank you for joining us once again for another episode of the Crow Canyon webinar series. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to how these webinars work in case you haven't joined us before. Then I'll be introducing our speaker, Dr. Sarah Oas, and then we'll get on with the show. First, I want to thank two people who are really working extremely hard to make this possible. Dylan Schwindt, who's our director of IT at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, has really, he's really been the person who's made it so that we can work remotely at Crow Canyon, and then so that we can share the things that us and our scholars have learned with you remotely. Through this incredible technology. So thanks to Dylan for making all this happen. And then Taylor Hasbrook has been the core person putting together these webinars, arranging our speakers, making sure everybody's comfortable on camera every single week. So thanks to Taylor for creating a great webinar series. For those of you joining us today who maybe have never used Zoom before, we're all getting used to it, but this could be your first webinar on Zoom, and there's a couple of things that are different. The first thing is you'll notice the little floating heads. You see me in the corner up here, and Sarah's there. Wave, Sarah. We're in the corner, and our heads will be, or Sarah's head will be, during her presentation. But if her head is ever in your way, you can actually just click that little window and move her head. Or there's a little narrow bar in the upper part of the little head window. And if you click that, it'll minimize Sarah's head and get it out of your way. We will be taking questions during Sarah's talk. Sometimes she'll ask us if we have any questions. At other times, I might just interject if somebody asks a really good one. And the way that you ask questions is actually through the Q&A button down in the bottom of your screen if you're on Zoom. So wiggle your mouse or tap your screen if you're on mobile, and you'll see a Q&A button, and that's where you should ask your questions. There's the chat thing there too. That can be helpful, but the Q&A is really where you're at. If you're joining us online or on Facebook, or if you're having difficulties on this live stream, you can join us on Facebook. Go to facebook.com, Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. If you want, you can ask questions there in the chat. I'll be monitoring that and pulling together questions for Sarah. And then, as always, you can subscribe to us on YouTube. So if the live stream isn't working for you today, by this evening, Sarah's presentation will be up on Crow Canyon's YouTube channel. You can get to it easily, crowcanyon.org/YouTube. For those of you who are not familiar with Crow Canyon, I just want to tell you a little bit about it. We're a research and education institution down in southwestern Colorado, and we're almost 40 years old, and we started in 1983. And through that time, we've had a really consistent mission. Our mission has been to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. From the beginning, we've been doing research in the Four Corners region and involving citizen scientists and descendant communities in answering those research questions. And I'm really pleased today to have Dr. Sarah Oas with us, who was a research intern at Crow Canyon. She's got her own history with Crow, and is now a research associate at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. And we've got some collaborative work going on that I'll tell you about in a minute. We've got two upcoming webinars next week. Real excited about this. Leaving Footprints in the Ancient Southwest. Dr. Ben Bellarata is going to be talking about his dissertation work. It's not to be missed. And then Historic Influences in Contemporary Pueblo Pottery with Charles King. So please be sure to join us for the next 2 weeks. So now it's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Oas. Dr. Oas is a postdoctoral fellow currently at the School for Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. She received her doctorate in anthropology from ASU last year. She holds a master's from Simon Fraser University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan. And Sarah is a paleoethnobotanist. That's a big word. She'll explain what it means in her talk, I'm sure. But she's been collaborating with Crow Canyon for a long time to understand the ancient foodways, how people created cultures around food and cuisine, and to understand that through the plant materials that they left behind. Dr. Ois has been doing research all over the world. She's had research projects in Ghana and in the Caribbean, and she specializes in the archaeology of the Southwest. She's interested in foodways, ethnobotany, political ecology, ethnoarchaeology, and environmental archaeology. And Sarah has the distinction of having written the best dissertation in the field last year. Of two. No, that's right. That's true. She received the Society for American Archaeology Dissertation Award for the work that she's going to be presenting to us now. So we're really lucky to have her. Everyone, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sarah Ois. And Sarah, I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then you can take it away.
Thank you, Kyle. There have been a few comments in the chat about sound. I'm not sure if that's on other connection ends. If it persists, I can attempt to use a sort of a headset, but I'm going to just keep going here for now.
Yeah, you sound good to me.
All right. I guess I'll keep going, Kyle.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, you sound a little far away. So, do you want to try it with the mic real quick?
Yeah,
okay. Thanks for holding with us, folks.
Let's see. Does this work better?
Sounds about the same to me.
Okay.
Yeah. I think you're good. I think we should just get going.
All right. I will do that. All right. Well, thank you all for coming today. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Kyle. I'm excited to be here and sharing the presentation of some of my dissertation research. I'm going to be talking today about work that addresses relationships between foodways and processes of social transformation. And it's a bit surreal to be presenting on social transformations in what is arguably the midst of one. But it's also an interesting time because I see a lot of people connecting and engaging a lot more richly with food in this, as all this kind of turmoil surrounds us. And I'm going to begin today with unpacking a few of the terms in the title. So beginning with foodways. Foodways are the ways we produce, prepare, and consume food. Foodways are an important part of every human society and culture. Foods are not only important for building and supporting our physical bodies, but we can also consider them to have great environmental, social, symbolic, and political significance. When I refer to social transformations, I'm drawing here on definitions used by a variety of scholars studying issues of social resilience and vulnerability in the past, where social transformations can be considered lasting and major changes in settlement, economy, and socio-political organization, such that people's life's experiences before and after transformations are substantially different. While in some cases, these kinds of changes may be gradual, this afternoon I'm going to be focusing on examples when they were rapid and likely occurred in the space of less than a generation. And while I am going to be talking about histories of food in the past, I'm going to depart a little bit from my dissertation where I sort of frame this in terms of two breads, the Hopi Piki bread and fry breads, and bring in a little discussion of some contemporary food moments. And looking through this lens of food, I'm going to highlight a few of the themes that are going to persist throughout this talk. We can consider food as a fundamental part of social life and relationships. Our access, cultural values, and personal preferences for food directly influence our diets and daily activities, what we consume and who we consume it with. Many layers of our social identities, including understandings of personhood, gender, and ethnicity, are expressed and reinforced through our foodways. The meals we share and consume play a central role in building memories and negotiating social relationships, especially at larger social and political scales. Finally, both as symbols and events, foods and feasts become vehicles and rallying points for mobilizing coordinated and collective social and political action. And it's these social and cultural dimensions of food that I'm going to be focusing on today. One of two major points that I'm going to be arguing is that foodways, and especially their social and cultural dimensions, offer a unique window into the historic process, context, and experience of social transformations. For some, this pandemic and periods of quarantine may be associated with learning or relearning kitchen skills, reconnecting with family over meals shared at home, pining over yeast, and taking pride and perhaps some comfort in the taste of freshly baked sourdough bread. Food is a powerful source of comfort. Its sensory qualities associate strongly with our memory, and we might imagine sourdough breads will take on some new layers of association for many going forward. Simultaneously, this sourdough food experience can be contrasted with the experience of many others whose foodways are currently characterized by scarcity and uncertainty. In this way, examining current events through the lens of foodways highlights differences and current inequalities in our society. We can also consider how experiences of social transformation vary with our participation in the complex modern food system. While many of us are largely consumers of food, those who are producers, processors, preparers, and cooks in various agricultural and restaurant industries are profoundly affected in different ways by the current pandemic. The second major point I'm going to argue is that we should consider foodways as they are conserved or changed to play an important role in processes of social transformation. I think a fantastic example of the political power of foods is the phenomena of the American bake sale. And specifically, I'm referencing how Paulo Velez and two other professional bakers in Washington, D.C. launched an international bake sale at the beginning of June, which has spanned dozens of cities in 16 countries and raised over $1.5 million in the span of about 2 weeks. And continuing on this theme of sort of the role of food in processes of social change, I'm going to step back a little in time and talk a little about fry bread. Fry bread, also referred to as Indian tacos, were developed by a number of tribes in the 19th century. The historic root of these breads can be traced to colonial processes, including forced relocations and the formation of reservations, the loss of food sovereignty, and the introduction of American government food commodities on reservations and at Indian schools. The rise of fry bread to fame is actually a fairly recent development, and one that can be linked to media produced by and for Native audiences, like the film Smoke Signals and the mockumentary More Than Fry Bread. Fry breads have also emerged as popular staple features and events showcasing intertribal indigenous North American culture, including powwows, Indian markets, Indian taco championships, and fry bread is even featured as a traditional staple at the Mitsutam Cafe at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. The high value placed on fry bread has not been without controversy within Native communities, given the colonial associations and the concerns over the nutritional value of this food. Ultimately, fry bread has come to be a food associated with collective expression of indigenous survival, pride, and identity across North America, and somewhat paradoxically, a symbol of Native resurgence and resistance. This brief examination of food in a time of pandemic and the history of fry bread illustrates some of the major ways we can model and understand the importance of foodways in the past and in periods of social transformation, and how foodways may be conserved or changed through time as part of broader social and political processes. We can consider how shared experiences, identities, and histories are expressed through food. Fry bread in particular provides an example of the important roles that foods play in the construction and expression of shared social identities and histories. And we can see how this is the case even though there are substantial underlying social differences. We can also recognize the special significance and value of fry bread is tied to its place in Native media and as a staple of public communal events. Finally, we consider how changes in foodways may have dramatic implications for the labor and lives of individuals tasked with preparing and providing these foods, and how studying foodways in these periods of transformation may highlight differences in the lived experience of individuals along the lines of, amongst others, race, gender, ethnicity, and social class. Transitioning now from contemporary foodways to foodways in the pre-Hispanic past, I'm going to provide a brief roadmap for the remainder of my presentation, which I might edit a little as time is needed. I'm going to begin with the conceptual approach I take to food and social transformations, introduce the Cibola case study and the sort of data sets that I'll be welding together, and then present a series of case studies from my dissertation, looking at continuity and change in cuisine, commensality, and the scale of food production and consumption. And then I'll sort of draw these strands back together and discuss what histories of cuisine and commensality tell us about the process and experience of social transformation in the Cibola region in the 13th and 14th centuries. As Kyle mentioned, he's curating questions right now, and I'll be checking in occasionally, especially for points of clarification if they're needed. But the majority of the questions will be addressed at the end. In the sort of conceptual approaches I'm taking, foodways are shaped by a complex range of influences, including broad biological and environmental constraints, as well as the social dimension, which makes food particularly valuable for studying social phenomena both today and in the past. And I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to check out some previous webinars, especially the one presented by Dr. Stephanie Crabtree, which really explores food from this complementary ecological perspective. My approach in this study to relationships between foodways and processes of social change employs two conceptual lenses: cuisine, the cultural logics and embodied traditions of food practices, and commensality, the socioeconomic and political dynamics of shared meals. In this research, I view cuisine and commensality as each acting or existing as part of larger social and cultural domains of food activities. Beginning with cuisine then, the first step is sort of distinguish between cuisine and diet. Diets are the specific types of food we eat, the amounts we consume, the timing and typical frequency of ingestion, and the nutritional values of these foods. In contrast, we can consider cuisines to be culturally shared styles and understandings of food and food practices in a particular place at a particular time. If we were to list the essential ingredients of cuisine, these might include, first, the shared cultural logics and rules surrounding appropriate foods and food behaviors. In other words, what are the various plants, animals, and minerals that we consume, when we consume them, and who can prepare and serve them. Cuisines are not only good to think, but also involve a wealth of bodily knowledge and skills that are transmitted as part of learning networks and communities of practice. I so strongly suspect a number of nascent bakers and cooks across the country right now are learning just how much time it takes to master preparing some kinds of food. Third, cuisines are often associated with specific core and signature ingredients. In the Southwest, we might consider a staple ingredient to be something like maize, while kind of a local signature ingredient would be something like hatch green chilies from New Mexico. Ingredients are combined in cuisines to produce distinct and recognizable flavor combinations, something we can encounter when we purchase prepackaged Italian or Chinese spice blends at a supermarket. Together, these sensory aspects of food are tightly tied to culturally shared notions of taste and the social construction of identity, memory, place, and history. From the perspective of the consumer, it is flavor that is typically the most memorable and socially significant aspect of meals. Finally, we can consider cuisines in terms of the necessary tools for combining, cooking, serving, and consuming foods. From an archaeological perspective, and in trying to address cuisines in the past, the easiest point of entry for archaeological studies of cuisines center on these material aspects: the tools, habitual techniques, the staple and signature ingredients, preferred flavor combinations, technologies, and the features used to prepare and consume food. If we think of cuisines in terms of our food culture, then the second conceptual lens I employ in this study is commensality, the event, performance, power, and cost of a consumed meal. The sharing of food at a meal draws attention to the social dynamics of food and foodways, when examined in context of serving and consumption of food and beverages, are highly symbolic, political, and socially expressive acts and forms of material culture. The necessity, frequency, and social significance and power of eating and drinking with others, both in our daily meals and at large special events, makes these activities especially relevant for studies of social and political change. Consuming food with others provides a sense of shared identity and solidarity. Sharing the act of consuming food creates a memorable bond between hosts and guests, even if guests are considered hostile potentially in other contexts. Studies of feasting highlight the important relationships between feasts and processes of economic intensification, how hosting and financing extravagant meals can be tied to increasing political complexity and the emergence of social inequality. In small-scale societies, these are very often tied to ritual practices. In thinking specifically about the roles of foodways in processes of social transformation, meals, especially those that shared at super household or communal scales, are important arenas. We might particularly expect food practices to play a more active role in constructing, communicating, and negotiating social identities and political relationships. Further, increases in the scale and inclusivity of public rituals might often be linked to increases in the scale of food production, preparation to fund these events. In thinking about archaeological approaches to commensality, meals involve a range of participants and spectators serving and consuming food. Some of the most memorable aspects of meals are the sensory qualities of foods, the smells, textures, tastes, and the appearance of different food and dishes. More materially, especially when involving larger groups, meals entail large amounts of foodstuffs and utensils and all the servingwares that are needed. Finally, we can think of meals in terms of their spatial settings and the kinds of acoustics, lighting, and other visuals that would be part of this experience. As with cuisine, these material aspects are easier to access archaeologically. And then before I move into the Cibola case study proper, I'm going to discuss the two kind of social transformations I'm going to be examining today. Beginning with population aggregation, this involves increasing numbers of family units within individual settlements. It also alters the distribution and size of communities at a regional scale. And finally, it reshapes the social landscape and patterns of interaction and exchange. I'm also going to be referring to the process of coalescence, which is a social process through which previously distinct and often diverse populations come together and integrate rapidly into a single socially cohesive community. And this is often characterized by social fluidity and innovation, as well as sociopolitical reorganization and economic intensification. In the US Southwest, evidence for the reorganization and intensification in ritual activities in the late 13th century have previously been linked to the needs to socially integrate aggregating populations. As such, we might generally expect ceremonial feasting and household investments in financing them similarly to increase through time as populations aggregated across the region. The costs then of participating and integrating into coalescent communities may often involve additional economic burdens and some decrease in household autonomy. Moving now into this sort of case study, the Cibola region spans east central Arizona and west central New Mexico. From north to south, Cibola settlements have traditionally been divided into one of two major pre-Hispanic culture areas in the US Southwest, the northern ancestral Puebloan and the southern Mogollon. And I examine foodways in the Cibola region through processes of aggregation and settlement manipulation beginning in the Pueblo III period, where households previously living in small hamlets joined together into large aggregated villages of up to 500 rooms. This period is also characterized by increasing public architectural size, which suggests some greater investment in integrating populations at the communal scale. In the study, I can compare trajectories in foodways at regional and sub-regional scales. Specifically, I examine foodways at three Cibola settlement areas: the Central Zuni, the Omorrow Valley, and the Upper Little Colorado. And the sites shown in red on this map are ones where I examine collections. The Pueblo IV period, again, the sites analyzed, shown in red, begins a bit earlier than in some other settlement regions in the Cibola region, and it's characterized by a range of dramatic social transformations across much of the northern US Southwest, which involved to varying degrees the concentration of populations into large, dense, plaza-oriented towns, the development or adoption of new integrative ideological and religious forms, and extensive regional depopulations and large-scale long-distance migrations. In the Cibola region, this period is associated with a shift from aggregating room blocks, those villages talked about for the Pueblo III period, to about 40 large towns, with both the aggregated villages in the previous period and the nucleated towns established. These were constructed and occupied for what seems to be very brief periods, sometimes less than a single generation, suggesting these changes in settlement and social organization may have been relatively unstable. While populations aggregated and condensed across the Cibola region, the process differed somewhat across each of the three settlement sub-areas. This is just showing that sort of shift from village to town. And they contrast a bit in terms of the extent of population growth, the pace of the social change, and the degree to which it involved the incorporation of local populations versus the incorporation of distant migrant groups. In the Omorrow Valley and Central Zuni areas, families saw dramatic and unprecedented changes in their social and built environments over the course of one or two generations. This process was particularly rapid and dynamic in the Omorrow Valley, where large groups joined in novel ways in previously lightly occupied areas. In the Upper Little Colorado settlements grew at a relatively slower rate, but the process involved the mixing of socially and ideologically diverse groups and sometimes the incorporation of distant migrant families. And I'm going to be returning at some points to this sort of sub-regional comparative framework. From mapping out the Cibola region and discussing processes of social transformation, I'm going to take a moment and discuss some of the major sources of data that I draw together in my studies of cuisine and commensality. This study draws on a wide range of archaeological materials that are seldom combined together. If we think about the major questions that guide this research as meals, the following slides present the major ingredients or types of data that are drawn together throughout my dissertation. Together, these data allow me to compare direct trajectories of cuisine and commensality, both temporally and spatially across the Cibola region. So when looking at cuisine, first establishing baselines and then kind of looking at their histories through time to answer the question of what is being consumed, I look at a mixture of, I look at specific core and local and signature ingredients and distinctive flavors to understand changes in the scale of food production, how much is being grown. To answer both these questions, I draw on a large database of plant remains from 54 sites, as well as faunal databases from 36 sites, and these constitute a real regional sample. In looking at the techniques and tools to prepare, cook, and serve different foods, as well as changes in the organization and intensity of food production, I look at a more concentrated sample from these three settlement regions, including a ceramic database, a brownstone database, and an architectural database. And finally, and it won't be brought a whole lot into this presentation, I draw some on ethnographies, previous studies of ethnobotany, and contemporary cookbooks. Kyle?
Yes. So some people are still having a little bit of trouble understanding, and so if you wouldn't mind just slowing down just a little bit, and I don't think you need to hold your mic. Then maybe people will have a little easier time of it. Some people are saying that it's echoey on their end, so perhaps if you just slow down just a little. But this is super interesting, so I'm sorry to have interrupted you.
Oh no, please. Thank you for letting me know. All right, so I'm going to try to go a little slower. Kyle, if you jump in again, give me maybe 10-minute notice. I might just have to skip a case study if I'm going much slower, and that's
all right.
fine.
I'll keep an eye on things.
That's fine. All right, thank you. So I'm going to start in this discussion of cuisine at the local scale with an example of continuity in the maintenance of cuisine. And so I've emphasized that flavor is one of the most culturally and socially important aspects of cuisine, and that flavors are expected to be conservative and local. So in this case, I'm going to draw on some plant data, some architectural data, and some ethnographic research to provide one instance of this. So what this table is showing, it looks complex, but as a first step in understanding what are the commonly shared staples and what are more local signature ingredients, I went through this large regional data set of macrobotanical data that I used to characterize and compare the different types of plant foods being consumed across the region through time. And what this table is broadly capturing is temporally stable trends in plant use. The taxa on the left are grouped little by domestic versus wild, and then within the wild or potentially cultivated species, these are showing different life histories. So plants that are annual and competitive in open, exposed areas, and then plants that are perennial and slower growing. And what's in the center here is this comparison across the three core subregions and some additional comparative subregions, where these plants that are present in more than half of the study sites within these settlement clusters are highlighting these sort of sub-regional local signature ingredients. So a couple of these do stand out for some of the subregions. And the one I'm going to focus on right now, though, is tomatillo, which is only highlighted in the central Zuni area. And so kind of zooming in even further into the scale of hearths in houses, I wanted to look more specifically at what plant ingredients are being recovered from hearths where presumably a lot of food preparation like toasting and cooking were occurring. And again, you can see that in the central Zuni, over a quarter of hearths that were analyzed, tomatillo was recovered. Tomatillos and sauces made with them are still featured in contemporary Zuni cookbooks and gardens. And ethnographic and ethnobotanical records over the last century further support the lasting importance of this ingredient in Zuni cuisine. While this brief discussion of tomatillo provides only a single example of how flavors were produced and maintained in the Cibola region, the enduring importance of this ingredient highlights the potential of drawing on a range of archaeological and ethnographic sources to examine trajectories in the central properties and flavors of food in the past. And from the local, I'm now going to jump up to the regional scale and examine a major change in cuisine. So I'm going to be examining the increasing importance of finely ground maize flours and the introduction and adoption of special flatbreads in the Cibola region. And this will involve tracing out changes in the production, preparation, and cooking of staple foods, types of maize produced, the intensity of grinding, and then, as I said, the adoption of novel cooking techniques and technologies. And in doing this, I'm going to discuss a little bit connections between cuisine and commensality and some of the performative aspects of foods and meals, considering how novel foods are adopted, and then kind of how flavor, texture, and technical difficulty play a role in it. And then the data I'm going to be featuring here are cob row numbers, study of metate types and mono use-wear patterns, and then evidence of whole and fragmented sandstone griddles. All right, and so one of the things we might expect if there was a shift in the ways that staple foods are being prepared, and specifically if breads were becoming more central to cuisine, is a shift in the types of maize being produced. And one of the major ways maize landraces are distinguished by growers and cooks beyond kernel color are differences in the endosperm composition of kernels. The 5 major endosperm types in traditional southwestern maize are pictured up in the right here. While pops and flints, probably some of the earliest maize in the Southwest, are surrounded by this hard corneous layer and outer skin, you can see the contrast that with a flour where it's virtually all starchy endosperm. These attributes of kernels factor in terms of how maize tastes, how easily it can be stored, how easily it is to grind and cook. Broadly, flinty types of corn are preferred for stewing as they retain their texture better, but are rather onerous to grind. Floury types, in contrast, are easy to grind and are preferred for dishes made of corn flour. A number of maize land races have previously been identified in the Cibola region, including foundational work by the botanist Hugh Cutler, on materials excavated by Paul Martin in the Field Museum, particularly. And previously identified types include a range of pop, flint, and flour types. And while there is less confidence given today in applying these sort of traditional landrace names to ancient maize, patterns in row number remain important for understanding the changes in varieties in the past. And as I'll briefly mention, these are supported in some interesting ways by recent ancient genetic work. For today, my interest is in patterns in the production of 8-rowed maize in the 13th and 14th centuries. In this table here, you can see changes in cob row number over time. And as you can see, it's likely that the diversity of maize landraces was preserved, but there's a real noticeable increase in 8-rowed corn through time. And I want to also note that this is a similar pattern that was observed at Salmon Ruin, where John Dobley and Priscilla Bohr looked at kernel endosperm, row number, and also changes in groundstem technologies. And I do want to bring in here a little of the genetic data that supports an increasing interest in flour over time. Dafinesca and colleagues tested a large population of cobs at Tularosa Cave and documented a strong selection for starch traits through time, showing a more than 60% decrease in the diversity of this particular gene, sugary 1, through time. And this gene is interesting because it's critical for starch properties of kernels, especially the gelatinization properties needed for creating foods like tortillas. Switching now to grinding evidence. In the Southwest, metates have taken on a number of forms. Broad shifts, which scholars like Jenny Adams and Patty Crown have discussed, include a shift from early basin and flat concave types to more formally designed and larger metates, changes that have been associated with agricultural intensification and increasing intensity in maize grinding. For formally designed trough and flat types, experimental work conducted by Jenny Adams suggests that these types are better suited for grinding different types of substances, namely flinty kernels and things like floury kernels and soft dough like masa. Looking at metate types in the Cibola region, Again, this showing changes in the styles, and then through time, you can see there's quite a shift by the P4 to the flat type. And this dovetails really nicely with the previous COV row number data. And you can see these match fairly well. And I looked not only at the sort of styles of metates, but the ways that monos were being used. Because again, you would expect with increasingly important fine flours that there would be changes in the intensity of grinding. So I looked at mono use life, and this is how patterns in the manufacture and wear of monos reveal different strategies to extend the use life of tools versus increasing the number of surfaces that can be used to prolong grinding. And one of the basics with using a mono is that you need to keep refreshing or pecking a surface to keep the edge and thus to efficiently grind a meal. So when you have more sides, you don't have to stop and refresh as often. But this wears out the tool quite quickly. And so here again, on each subregion, documenting the shift from the P3 to P4 in the number of used sides. And again, there's a significant shift, towards 3 and 4-sided tools in the P4 period. And the final thing I'm going to kind of look at is evidence for the adoption of special griddle technologies used to cook maize flatbreads. Archaeological studies by Chuck Adams and others indicate that by the early 14th century, flatbread cuisines were adopted to at least some degree across the northern U.S. Southwest. Work particularly at Hopi suggests this was a widespread change in cuisine, and it was linked in important ways to these processes of social transformation involving rapid reorganization in settlements and changes in religious practice. This table summarizes evidence for early flatbread cooking technologies from Middle Colorado and Hopi Mesas, and you can see these earliest dates and these much more kind of high volume of peaky fragments are found consistently in these regions. And so the previous understanding of how these technologies appeared in the Cibola region was that they came in significantly later and were always kind of marginal, at least in these protohistoric periods. And then part of what came out of this dissertation and working with 20 plus collections, 7 different institutions, working with all this legacy data was that there were actually a number of much earlier fragments, again, not very high volume compared to the number of them excavated. But the upper Little Colorado really stands out here as potentially an important avenue of introduction of this flatbread technology into the Cibola region. And surprisingly, the Omorrow Valley and the central Zuni area also show some evidence for fairly early, at least experimentation with this food technology. So thinking about this change in cuisine, and identity and ideology, it does appear that in the upper Colorado, that's this area that was high in terms of social diversity. This played a particularly important role in changing cuisine. So fine flours can be thought about in this larger context of changes in communal identity, religious belief, and then likely in commensal practice in feasting in these plazas. Switching gears a little now to commensality, food production, and consumption intensification, I'm going to kind of take a more regional look and examine how communities in the Pueblo III and Pueblo IV periods intensified plant and animal food production. And I'm going to look specifically at increases in the ubiquity of crops, increases in the ubiquity of pioneering animal plants, and increases in the ratio of hunted and produced animal foods, and then drawing on these large regional databases of plant animal data. So this here is showing changes in the ubiquity of maize recovered from the 54 sites spanning the Pueblo II to the Pueblo IV periods in the Cibola region. And maize, what stands out here is maize is recovered from virtually every sample recovered in the Pueblo IV period. And while it's been noted that recovery rates of maize are highly variable in time and space across the greater Southwest, these results suggest that thorough regional scale comparisons of maize ubiquity from numerous sites and well-dated samples can provide meaningful insights into shifting food production practices through time. And bringing into this the ubiquities of weedy annual species that thrive in disturbed environments. These are expected also to increase in conjunction with the establishment of larger, denser settlements and increasing agricultural expansion. This is especially the case when agricultural intensification involves the extension of cultivated fields and garden areas and the expansion of water and soil control infrastructure, thinking here about things like irrigation ditches, check dams. As such, it's significant that similar trends in the increasing ubiquity of domesticated crops, maize, beans, and squash, are mirrored in a variety of these smaller colonizing species, amaranth, goosefoot, purslane. And so while the botanical evidence strongly supports arguments for agricultural intensification and expansion around settlements, there are also equally interesting patterns in the procurement and production of meat. Here are faunal indices that provide that indicate differences in the hunting of artiodactyl species, antelope, and deer. These are contrasted with a turkey index, and both of these indices take the number of individual specimens and contrast artiodactyls in one case and turkeys in the other with what is presumed to be the most common source of dietary protein, which are rabbits. And so what you can see through time are increases in both, which is unusual. Increasing production of turkeys in more northern parts of the Southwest is usually associated with a depopulation and a loss of artiodactyl populations. So this is an unusual pattern coming out of the Cibola region, and it suggests that perhaps increases in turkey production are less tied to overhunting and resource depression, and then as scholars like James Potter have argued, potentially linked to feasting and the growing needs of households to provide meat for communal rituals. From examining intensification in food production across the Cibola region, I'm going to return to the sub-regional scale, kind of conclude these case studies with a discussion of trajectories in the scale of cooking, focusing just on the Omorrow Valley in this case. So I'm going to talk a little bit about previous studies of feasting, particularly the work of James Potter, who looked both at increases in the rim diameters of jars as well as his faunal evidence to argue for increasing procurement and consumption of artiodactyls, turkeys, and other foods in plazas. And I'm also going to examine evidence for super household cooking and specifically changes in the proportion of specialized large cooking vessels across the region. And I'm doing this by drawing on a study of corrugated jar volumes. Jars are a difficult ceramic to estimate volume for, as very few are recovered intact or reconstructible. And as the figure on the right displays, the orifice diameter, the diameter of the rim, can vary substantially even if the size of the jar body remains similar. And this variability in the rim diameter is likely tied to the range of cooking techniques being employed and the different needs to access the contents of the jars while cooking or to restrict water loss. And empirical studies suggest that relationships between rim diameter and vessel height are much stronger. When you don't have vessel height, you have to be a lot more cautious with using just rim diameters. Another possibility for obtaining measures of jar volume, and the one employed in this study, involved calculating jar volume using curvature measures on large body sherds. And then these are based on experimental studies of whole broken vessels with a known volume. And as long as there's an approximately spherical shape, this calculation provides a fairly accurate sense of volume. So with the body sherd curvature data, this figure here provides a markedly different and somewhat surprising picture of vessel patterns across the Cibola region. As the figure shows, there's a consistent left skew in the volumes of cooking sherds, suggesting that across the Cibola region, the bulk of daily household meals were prepared in relatively small jars, holding somewhere between 15 to 20 liters. While the central Zuni and upper Licata areas, cooking jars are overall similar in size, this much longer tail of cooking vessels seen for the Omorrow Valley in both time periods really does stand out. And this difference is even more apparent if you just examine the percentage of large cooking jars. And here I'm defining large cooking jars as those between 30 to 50 liters, or roughly double the size of the most common sauce pot, for lack of a better word. On the upper Little Colorado and the central Zuni areas, there appears to have been a general decrease over time in the amount of large cooking jars in assemblages. These patterns in cooking jar size suggest that perhaps financing large communal events in aggregated villages often place greater demands on the preparation and cooking labor and resources of households in the Pueblo III period as opposed to Pueblo IV period. The Omorrow Valley provides a slightly different sequence, as significantly higher proportions of large cooking jars were produced in this settlement area in both Pueblo III and IV periods. Given similar overall increases in the settlement size through time, the marked difference in the proportion of large cooking jars between the central Zuni and Omorrow Valley areas is interesting. In the Cibola region and beyond, some of the very first large nucleated pueblos were established in the Omorrow Valley in the 13th century. So again, returning to this sort of comparative scheme for the three subregions, given similar overall increases in settlement size through time, this raises questions about how social diversity at this pace of change and demographic growth played a part in these unusually large numbers of cooking jars, large cooking jars in the Omorrow Valley. Population aggregation and settlement concentration in the Omorrow Valley was rapid and involved dramatic demographic growth and construction of novel settlement forms in previously uninhabited area. These factors all likely contributed, creating a relatively more unstable or fluid social environment compared to the neighboring central Zuni area, which has an occupation history spanning thousands of years and a slower rate of settlement growth. Far higher proportions of cooking jars in the Omorrow Valley suggests that super household commensal events rapidly emerged and persisted as critical mechanisms for negotiating and maintaining cooperative relationships within and between these newly established communities. And I suggest that the unique settlement history and the speed of demographic growth documented in the Omorrow Valley played a greater role in increasing scales of commensal activities in the settlement area than increases in settlement size and population density alone. And so in this kind of last few moments of this presentation, I want to consider a little how foodways provide insights into the experience of social transformation. By examining how different foods, technologies, and culinary techniques became incorporated into daily life through time in the Cibola region, the study provides a unique perspective into the ways individuals and households were able or unable to connect to and participate in social and political life at different scales through their food practices. The results of the study indicate that food production, maize grinding, and communal consumption intensified through the late 13th century. There is little evidence for change in the organizational scale of many food activities, however. Instead, most food storage, preparation, and cooking activities remained organized at the scale of individual households or possibly extended families. As communities integrated, we might also expect certain kinds of activities, like the extension and maintenance of agricultural water and soil features, might have been managed at somewhat larger scales and have become more efficient as a result. We might also contrast this with the experiences of young women who likely took on the extra labor of food preparation and cooking. While there are undoubtedly social aspects of food preparation that may have benefited some women, perhaps added prestige over producing complex flatbreads, the shift to finely ground flours came with a dramatic increase in intense hard labor. So I'm kind of wrapping up today. What I have argued is that foodways provide an important window into periods of social transformation, and further that changes in foodways were an essential part of transformations. I've demonstrated this by drawing on a wide range of archaeological materials and ethnographic research to document how increases in the scales of food production and shifts in cuisine tied to public commensal practice over much of the region were an important part of processes of social and political reorganization. Acts of provisioning and sharing food at communal commensal events were an essential part of the social work of integrating and maintaining large, dense communities. In periods of rapid population aggregation and settlement growth in the Cibola region in the 13th and 14th centuries. Further, this study provides a unique perspective into the ways individuals and households were able to connect to their larger social and political landscape through their food practices. And in studying daily food practices, this provides an important window into networks of food production and consumption decisions that can be scaled from households to communities and even to broader regional perspectives. By understanding how different foods, technologies, and culinary techniques were incorporated into daily life, these studies of past foodways shed light on the ways individuals and households connected to each other and to different areas, and also provide a somewhat distinct perspective on than purely economically and environmentally oriented studies of food production. And I suggest that studies of foodways, and specifically the social dimensions of food, offer a promising and often underutilized resource in terms of information about past processes of population aggregation, social integration, and transformations in the political economies of small-scale societies in the past. I'm particularly thinking about these things along the lines of age, gender, and perhaps even religion or ethnicity in terms of people's foodways. All right, so some acknowledgments. Funding was provided this by NSF grant, as well as funds from the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society, the Arizona State University School of Human Evolution and Social Change, and the Graduate and Professional Student Association. Also want to thank my committee and the collections of those individuals facilitating collections access. I also want to acknowledge members of Zuni Pueblo who helped facilitate the Zuni Foodways project. All right, thank you.
Great presentation. That was wonderful. Thank you. We have some really good questions that came in during your presentation, and I'm going to start off with one that that was just a really interesting comment, and then I've sort of worked it into a question because it triggered something for me and made me think of something. So Jenny says, she was talking about food, and she says, my New York City Jewish husband's diet is worlds apart from mine. She's from Georgia and she's Baptist, but the ingredients are familiar. However, they've traveled a lot worldwide, and they see that in Africa, for example, the ingredients may be totally different. So Jenny's comment made me think of a question, which is thinking about the development of cuisine. And you could think of it as an evolution, a sort of cultural evolution, but just the development of a cuisine. What matters more in that development? Is it the particular foodstuffs that are available for people to utilize, or is it more of a cultural trajectory? And is there evidence for convergent cuisines in regions of the world that have very different food availability, types of food that are available, a convergence on how people utilize food to negotiate social relationships?
Oh, that's a complex question.
Yeah.
I do want to start, I'll have to unpack that a little bit by saying there's no group that we know of who use every possible source of food in a region they're in. So decisions of what is edible are very cultural, but they're also tied to interaction and exchange. And, you know, it's an open question. How do cuisines change? It's mostly been addressed by folks studying colonial contexts. The assumption, especially by archaeologists, is that cuisines are a deeply conservative aspect. In part, that's because they're part of basic socialization, and especially small-scale societies producing most of their own food. They're part of the daily fabric of life throughout, seasonally, and so these things are really, really ingrained. And they don't have access to modern supermarkets. But one of the important ways that these things will change is people start substituting and occasionally innovating in terms of the familiar, adding in something new, say maize. Maize is going to add into a cuisine that previously produced and prepared things like amaranth in a particular way. So those kind of maize and as foods that fit into existing sort of way of understanding how food works, that's definitely one of the ways I think cuisines do change. And then I think kind of the issue of commensality is really important there as well. When you're sharing foods, when you're sharing meals with different groups, that's an important kind of avenue of exposure. And then depending on sort of the weight of then making that food yourself and what that signals, that might happen, or it might be really, really suppressed and that food might be rejected. I think fry bread is a good example of that just the real wide spectrum of opinions in any given Native community potentially about fry bread.
Thank you. You also talked towards the end, and actually throughout your talk, about the transformations in labor that occur with the adoption of new cuisines or intensified cuisines, like the intensification of maize agriculture. And you use the example of women grinding. Do we see, and you got into this a little bit, we see archaeologically, materially, an increase in the grinding apparatuses for making flour. Do you see an increase in the size of fields or the amount of land that's devoted to agriculture as part of that transformation?
That's a good question. This one is a little complicated. In the Zuni ancestral Zuni area, this period, the Pueblo 3 to Pueblo 4 transition, was a lot of climatic instability was happening, and farmers were experimenting and making use of different landscape areas. And they were doing a lot of dryland upland farming. In fact, most of the settlements in the Pueblo 3 shifted upland to sort of capture this. So the number of field features skyrockets in the Pueblo 3, but it's hard to tease that apart with changing settlement patterns. But indirectly, I tried to get at that through those measures of maize ubiquity, those measures of other colonizing plants in an agricultural landscape. And so I absolutely think yes, but it is hard to really directly measure that.
We see it as much. Tim asks, he says, great talk. Can you try to succinctly state your observations about the increased importance of Piki bread as a causal model? Why do these changes happen, in your opinion? Why the changes in Piki bread?
So I think the role of this as sort of a novel, visually distinctive food fits into sort of previous arguments that have been made about decorative pottery and the sort of importance of ceremonial ritual events occurring in plazas. I think its novelness in some ways matched or spoke to these really significant shifts, the addition of these more communal forms of practice and these kind of new emergent larger identities as communities, as amongst oral traditions and the Hopi and the Zuni, these kind of emerging larger identities beyond tribes and sort of these different groups who came together through time. But I don't know, I expect this was not something that probably occurred everywhere, and it probably didn't occur evenly. I think the work on the Hopi mesas shows this the best, and I think it's still a question how much were bred Zuni Hewe in this case. When did that really become much more common? And I think it's still a question, and I don't know. We see early evidence for it, but it may have been just a blip. It's on the landscape, but the specific importance of this one bread, I can't, I'm not confident about that.
Got it. We have we've got more questions rolling in. There's two classes of questions that I think are really interesting. The first class has to do with gender, which you talked about a bit in your talk, and you used examples of women, or at least a photo of women grinding corn and those sorts of things. How do we, Susan asked, how do we assess gender in ancient culture? How do we know that those same gender roles as they pertain to cuisine held in the past as they do in contemporary Pueblo communities?
That's a great question. And I think there's a couple different threads that people pull on when presenting that argument. Some of which are sort of cross-cultural comparative studies that have been done on labor and gender, and in which case, cross-culturally, women do tend to take on the majority of those sort of food preparation tasks. And specifically for the Southwest, there's oral traditions and histories of these different groups and their pasts. There's also skeletal evidence, certain sorts of wear on bones that you'd expect from
shoulders and things.
Yeah, and then knees, because these were grinding bins. These metates would be in bins, And sometimes there's little divots, there's ways that people sort of fit into the ground and just spend hours on hours grinding. And they do leave these signatures on the bones.
So you've got that gendered evidence in the archaeological material. Do you have evidence of disparities in how different genders or different classes of people, whether they were actually enjoying the fruits of their labors? So, so you've got maybe women doing a lot of the grinding. Are women consuming more maize? Is there any sort of gender breakdown in nutrition or in actual consumption that we can tease apart?
There is very little direct information to that line. The two kinds of direct evidence being coprolites and sort of biogeochemical signatures in bones. And coprolites, you're not going to know the gender necessarily. And then, there's only a handful of studies, like work at Grasshopper, where there's gendered large collections of isotopic studies. There's also sort of a political history to respectfully studying human remains in the Southwest, and that certainly enters into this in terms of how much direct evidence there is. And then the Grasshopper case is certainly not, you can't speak for the rest of the Southwest, so there isn't a whole lot of direct information there. One thing I will say about really finely ground maize is that there's a very diminishing point in returns in terms of reducing a grain and then how easily absorbed it is. At a certain point, it goes fast and you lose a lot of fiber. What you get is sweetness, but not necessarily a whole lot of other nutritional benefit. And if you're spending an awful lot of time grinding, you really are losing out in that equation in terms of a very strictly diet perspective.
Yeah.
But if you look at the Hopi, that's a great example of the social status. Your identity as a woman very, very directly is tied to your ability to produce a food like this. Mm-hmm. So it's a complex question, in terms of status and prestige, but maybe not great dietarily strictly.
Got it. All right, we've got a couple of questions that are sort of more fun questions. The first one is, what is goosefoot and how is it prepared?
Okay, so these Chenopodium would be the Latin genus for it. Goosefoot is the English common name. So it's one of those small weedy looking greens that appear in the desert, and it produces a head with a lot of seeds on it. And its benefit in terms of preparation is both sort of as a green in sort of that lean season of the year before the maize comes up, and then as a seed, it's got really high actually oil content. And so some of the interesting recipes recorded for Zuni are the incorporation of goosefoot into maize dough. So dried maize, and this adds a lot of texture and flavor. So before maize, they're steamed, they're baked, they're boiled, they're ground into cakes. They seem to be sort of a supplemental flavor and texture boost, presumably for these periods.
And then we've got another question from Marilyn. She asks, how were hedgehog and fishhook cactus and other cacti prepared? Do we have any evidence for cactus preparation?
Not a lot of direct evidence, I'd say. Though there might be some uncarbonized remnants, dried pads in the case of prickly pears, certainly would have been eaten tuna. But the fruits, there's a lot of ethnographic discussion of how these were processed, and it's kind of a jam or a jelly processed, really refined very extensively into sort of these logs, which you could chop off a piece of. And what's interesting there is that would have been one of virtually the only really sweet foods available. So these might have been really highly prized, and then maybe added as a sweetener to things or consumed as sort of a special snack. It would probably be very hard, if it got carbonized, it would just be sort of this mass. Not a lot of direct evidence for like a log of processed cactus fruit, but that's presumably one way they would have been eating that.
Right. Well, that let me just check Facebook to make sure. Yes, that that finishes up our questions. And so I want to thank you again for giving this presentation. It was wonderful. It was wonderful to hear from you about this research this way. Everyone, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to join us again next week, it's at the same time with Ben Bellarato. And we really hope that you do. Have a great 4th of July weekend and see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks.